Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So good, good morning or afternoon or evening, depending a little bit on where you are joining us from. Um, my name is Philippe Daman. I'm a research manager at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies with the KU Leuven in Belgium. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody here and to moderate this webinar on HRBA, human rights based approaches and development in South and Southeast Asia. So this session is the fourth and, for our purposes, final webinar in our EU values series that explores human rights-based approaches to development cooperation and highlighting, let's say, some links between the European Union and different regions. So over the past weeks, we have discussed some global frameworks and regional perspectives, specifically from Latin America and Africa. Today, we're turning to Asia, where, of course, countries are also developing their own approaches to rights-based development in the context of very rapid economic transformation, huge environmental challenges, and, of course, also quite complex governance systems. So our webinars are organized within the framework, as I've mentioned, of the EU Values Project, which is a Jean Monnet network. So it's a collaboration of about 21 higher education institutions across 6 continents, involving almost 100 academic experts. And within the network, we really want to, let's say, enrich the debate and deepen the understanding of values of democracy, rule of law in the EU's foreign policy specifically, and how it interacts with other regions as key partners here. So I'm very happy to now introduce our distinguished speakers for today. So our first speaker is Dr. Miranda Tahalele, who is a subject content coordinator and lecturer in the Department of International Relations at BINUS University in Indonesia, Jakarta. She also serves as managing director of the Center for Business and Diplomatic Studies and is a managing editor of the Journal of Asian Studies. So her presentation will focus on integrating EU development cooperation policy into Indonesia's National Development Plan, challenges and opportunities in this respect. Our second speaker then is Mr. Rahul Desarda, who is an assistant lecturer at Jindal Global Law School and an assistant director at the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Peace Studies at the Jindal Global University in India. His talk will focus on HRBA, human rights-based approaches in India's green transition, rights, resettlement, and just energy. So we normally have about 10 to 15 minutes for our speakers, but today we have 2 speakers instead of 3. So this means we can have a little bit more leeway for our presentations as well as for the discussion afterwards. So let's say that we try to clock in at around 15 to 20 minutes for each presentation. I'm not going to be monitoring the time very closely, so just as kind of a ballpark figure for our presentations, 15 to 20 minutes. After the presentations, we will then open the floor for questions and discussions. Obviously, if you have a question, anybody in the audience has a question during one of the presentations, feel free to simply write them down in the chat. So all microphones are essentially muted for the audience members. So the only way to really interact is through the chat. I will monitor the chat throughout the webinar, and at the end of the presentations combined, I will select some of the questions that have been asked in the chat and engage with this in a discussion with our speakers. If you have a specific question directed at one of the panel members, or rather a general question indicated towards the entire panel, please indicate so in your written question as well. So once again, thank you so much for joining us for this fourth and final EU Values webinar on human rights-based approaches. And I am now very happy to invite our first speaker, Dr. Miranda, to take the floor.
Okay, thank you. Philip. Thank you for inviting me as well. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Miranda Tahalele from BINUS University. I want to share what Philip maybe already mentioned, integrating EU development policy into the Indonesian development policy as well. Opportunity and challenges. So let me share the screen so I have a bit of some sort of presentation for everyone. Everyone can see this? Yeah. Okay, good. Maybe I will start at least at least three topics that I want to discuss here. The first one maybe in general how EU development cooperation works within the ASEAN and Indonesia, a little bit of Indonesian EU history in that sense, and how what is actually the current progress up until now in terms of development cooperation, and then how and then the last one is talking about the whole challenge and opportunity. So even maybe in the last decade, we're talking about Indonesia, something that we cannot separate it is part of the because Indonesia is part of the ASEAN, and ASEAN is also engaged with a lot of more varied development partners, not only with the global north countries, which traditionally we work with, but also with the global south, especially China, Japan, South Korea, and others. Asia also responded to this new approach of global development policy, especially we're talking about post-Busan, something that goes beyond it, including in terms of trade, infrastructure, engaging with new actors, engaging with new approaches, including like, for example, blended finance, PPP, and other model of new financing for development. And then we also see those changes also applied within the context of globally Europe responding to the BRI, because if we're talking about ASEAN, BRI or Belt Road Initiative by China is quite huge in this region. This whole shift of approach, including model actors engaged in the development cooperation, also seen and how we also look at how actually the EU international development policy has been mandated, including to focus on the principle of complementary and coordination coherence, including integrating this human rights-based approach in the project implementation. But then there's also a significant extension of development cooperation approach in terms of aid, especially within the context of trade and infrastructure in the ASEAN, that also work within these two partners of global south and global north. And then if you're looking for specifically, we're talking about EU cooperation with the government of the ASEAN member countries, most of the government support program is actually channeled through ASEAN, not necessarily only through bilateral or by country itself. Um, so how actually this Indonesian works or apply this whole global development cooperation? I think if we're talking about Indonesia, I think it's one of the important partners in ASEAN. Indonesia is the first country in ASEAN that signed the PCA or the Partnership Agreement in 2014. But at the same time, we're talking about Indonesia because we have a long history on how we manage aid, which is not always good. We have a very Indonesia has applied a very rigorous regulation and management system for its aid or loan, including loan and grant received, including by integrating the whole context of national development cooperation applied by other countries to their need to be fit with what is going on in the national development planning process, as well as the vision and mission of the government of Indonesia. If you're looking also about the players in Indonesian development cooperation, EU is cooperation only list below or other major development partners works in Indonesia. Japan is the biggest lender for Indonesia, and the second now is China. The third is ADB or Asia Development Bank, World Bank, and then we also have AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. GVET Australia is also quite huge. And then raising new donors is also Middle East countries like Qatar. If you're talking about how actually this whole project was managed, because it all has to be managed by the government, if we're looking at specifically on the context of EU, a lot of EU project is not directly registered to the government of Indonesia aid management system, or in that sense of blue book and green book of the government, because a lot of EU project was implemented by NGO and civil society that is not compulsory to be registered within the government. Only EU project implemented by the government or as partner, it should be registered by them, including one that channeled through the World Bank. So I think in that sense, a lot of EU project is not only directly implemented by the EU. So before we go into the more current progress on that sense, we might want to see a bit of the history and trajectory, yeah, because it cannot be separated. Post 1994 45 as the part of end of Cold War and at the same end of World War II. At the same time, it's also the year of Indonesian Independence Day. Dutch at that time provide aid to the part of the part of the Marshall Plan to Indonesia. And then Sukarno era was where he leaned more toward the communist countries and take a strong stand against those Western aid. Suharto have strongly established what we identify as CGI, or Consultative Group on Indonesia, led by the Dutch. And then, but then it's demolished into the IGGI, led by the World Bank, or International Intergovernmental Group for Indonesia. And then post-New Order era, in early 2000, European Commission adopted what we call developing closer relation with Indonesia. And then this also started the shift during the Bambang Yudhoyono era, starting from 2004 to 2005 to 2015, where EU and some EU member countries signed what we identify as Jakarta Commitment. At the time was response to Paris Declaration of Aid Effectiveness Program. Jokowi era, we signed the PCA, and then we start the FTA negotiation process, and we just currently also signed what we identify as the EU JEPA in 2025. So this is part of the history and trajectory of relation with between Indonesia and EU itself. And then now, if we're talking about how we balance all of these issues, at least there's three main focus of the EU development cooperation in Indonesia, especially in terms of trade, investment, higher education, government, and human rights, as well as the last one is environment and climate change. Who are the partners? You know, a lot of partner or implementing partner of the EU will other European Development Agency, AFD, KfW, and they also engage with a lot of international development agencies like the World Bank, UNICEF, UN Habitat, international NGO. They also engage with a lot of their projects, European Forest Institute, UCLG Asia Pacific, and then you also have local NGO, YAPIKA, Sepaham, Walhi, and then private sector, including this is PT SME or Indonesian state-owned enterprises. Work within the whole, maybe a lot of island in Indonesia and over the past that also expand especially in some more remote areas. So what is actually the challenge? I mean, you're talking about Indonesia, Europe, EU is sometimes quite challenging, especially over the past 5 or 10 years. You know, for example, EU banned Indonesian palm oil in 2019, and EU still sued Indonesia on nickel or export in WTO in 2022. And then at the same time, because we are already in the context of a middle income country, the government of Indonesia is not eligible to receive any foreign grain, including all of those big projects in that sense. But then the question is actually how you can engage effectively with the local partner, especially beyond the traditional partner. Especially we're talking about SHERPA implementation. How do you engage with the business associates, digital online groups engage in economic and technology activities and also expand in Indonesia? Because if you're looking at the current situation, all the partners is still very traditional in that sense. And then in the context of implementing a human right as a norm, is it just implementing as part of the compulsory aspect or just a checklist, or how you actually monitor on the progress is still being questioned in that sense? Who you should report this one? Is it only to the EU or to the government of Indonesia as a recipient of those projects? So this is the whole challenge that we're looking at. However, we also see there's a lot of opportunity that we lead. Indonesia integrating the value of in the EU development cooperation in the Indonesian priorities, regulation, and system is still be possible, because in that sense, now the situation in Indonesia in terms of relation with you, we are still quite flexible in doing those sort of arrangement in that sense. And then it is also important to also building common understanding on the scope of the issues. For example, if we're talking about trade or engaging with the new actors or definition, I think the context or the definitions should just go beyond the definition that apply by the OECD, for example. I will lead on that in the next part as well, especially, for example, building up all the partnership formality with the government as well as local community. And this one is the last one that I want to also engage is how you should build up with the local communities like a small medium enterprises in that sense. Why it is important? Because now I think the focus of the government in that sense is building these communities. This is also very timely, is also because the government of Indonesia and EU have already signed the JEPA. What is actually the position of small medium enterprises? This might be need to be more understanding in the term of context, because if you're talking about the definition of small medium enterprises in terms of Indonesian definition and small businesses in terms of OECD or EU is totally something that is different. Yeah, so I think those terminology and this part of understanding with the to engage with the local community is especially in economic is highly important, and it is the place where all of these human rights approach can be applied, especially also women-owned SME, because the government also identified that, you know, that small medium enterprise in Indonesia is one of the most important backbone in economic. We passed the global financial crisis in 2008 because our small medium enterprises is very strong in that sense. But I'm not sure how European Union also engage in that in SME, especially within the STEPA itself. So I think that's part of the thing that we can expand and look at how it progress, especially in approaching human right economy, human right based approach, especially in terms of economic development of Indonesia. I think I come to the end of the this presentation, and thank you. I will give this back to you, Philip.
Yes, thank you so much, Miranda, for this quite comprehensive, thought-provoking presentation. So I think I think your analysis shows a lot of things, obviously, but one thing that shows is that EU development cooperation with ASEAN and Indonesia, it shows how profoundly let's say the global development landscape has shifted, right? From traditional aid to more, let's say, complex frameworks. Also with, as you mentioned, a lot of new important partners, not just north-south, but south-south as well. And I think your reflections on how to balance politics, economics, development, speak directly to the evolving character of, let's say, rights-based cooperation in the region. I think that this question of, let's say, how can development models, let's say, remain inclusive and rights oriented amid this rapid economic change leads us more or less naturally to our next speaker as well. Mr. Raul de Sarda will take us now from, let's say, the more institutional and policy dimension of EU-ASEAN cooperation to more of an environmental and social dimension of India's green transition and how it relates to human rights-based approaches. So, Mr. de Sarda, please, the floor is yours.
I think I should be audible now.
Yes, you are audible, and we can also see your presentation, so everything works.
Just let me select the view. It's kind of weird not to see myself just speaking to the presentation. Just one second. But my presentation is visible, right?
It is visible, yes, but maybe full screen would be.
Oh yeah, you mean the slideshow? Yes.
Slideshow, yeah. Yep, perfect. Great, thank you.
Okay. Yes. So thank you so much, Philip, again for organizing this and the EU Values Project. This presentation, I must acknowledge that it's part of growing body of research that I've been able to cover in the last presentations to seminars that we had, and also a lot of content that scholars in our network have provided me. So it's a result of a lot of work put behind the scenes by other people as well. So I wanted to acknowledge that. But coming to the presentation itself, so the topic of my presentation obviously is human rights based approaches in India's green transition, and the focus is on mostly on the rights and just energy transition that India needs to undertake. What are the positives, what are the challenges, and what are the way forward? So in terms of the structure of the presentation itself, my first part will discuss some of the conceptual framework relevant for our discussion so that we can pin down which are the relevant theoretical tools that we need to analyze. Second is the core part, which is India's transition. Third, the human rights based approaches gaps. Fourth, if we have time, we'll discuss one or two case studies. And fifth, recommendations. So, what are these human rights based approaches? So, primarily, we need to understand that human rights cannot be an addition to the developmental aspects regarding any like developmental project or environmental mechanisms. It has to be embedded within it. So, it cannot be an add on. And in terms of the hierarchy, also, it should always flow from norms. And this again comes from my training as a lawyer. This tendency to look at norms first and then build obligations from it and then finally place accountability. So that is the hierarchy we are looking at when it comes to human rights based approaches. And we'll also discuss substantive and procedural rights because especially in this context, if the right procedural issues are not resolved, then you have a situation where the actual remedy is rendered pretty much defunct. So, for instance, if people do not have access to justice in terms of implementation of their environmental rights, then it does not really matter what the content of the rights is. So, this is something that we must take into account. With respect to the transition being neutral, of course, there is enough body of research which proves that no transition till now one has been neutral and no transition is projected to be neutral. So there will be some costs and risks attached to it. So in terms of climate policy, um, if you have a policy that takes into account both the current setup, energy setup, and the future requirements, then that should, in an ideal world, redistribute costs. So, for instance, India right now is investing in green energy and is investing substantially in solar and wind-based projects. So, over a period of time, if this policy continues, it should redistribute some of this cost to recover. Also, with respect to lack of neutrality, the question of favoring certain geographies, again, we know that some states or some countries for that matter are more vulnerable than others. So again, we need to take into account some special circumstances when it comes to India. So India being a densely populated country with limited access to exportable natural resources has some inherent uh, issues which need to be fixed. In fact, if I may give you an anecdote of my side research as to why India will remain in middle income trap even if it is successful in its climate change transition. There are three reasons. India is the only country which has all three characteristics. One, it is hugely populated. Second, it does not have exportable resources in terms of oil, gold, or um, any rare earths that can provide quick dollars. And third, it's a democracy. So obviously, the transition is going to affect be affected by these factors. And finally, with respect to absorbing the shocks, the Indian government, you would notice, has been treading on a fine line in terms of if you look at the Paris Agreement obligations. They've tried to always fulfill the obligations, but whenever time comes, for instance, in COP28, it puts its foot down and says, sorry, we cannot phase out coal, or we cannot do this transition within this period. So it has been like trying to manage these risks as well. I just wanted to ensure I'm still visible because I still cannot see myself, so I'm just talking to the presentation.
Yes, yes, it's all perfectly visible. Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of India's commitments, now these are some major commitments. One, obviously, it is the only country which has a 2070 deadline for net zero. Even China, if I'm not wrong, is 2060 or 2065. So India is the country which will do it latest. Second, it has committed to 500 gigawatts of non-fossil electricity by 2030, which it has already achieved. It is already at 450 gigawatts, so that's not a problem. We'll discuss the specific issues such as the fact that there's no storage. So even if there's capacity, you need that storage in order to utilize that capacity. And with respect to again hydrogen, battery, and other electrical vehicles push, so it is a fact that Indian government has been on a steadfast commitment to like fulfill these obligations because it also looks at the the advantages that come from this transition, not only in terms of the economic costs, but also in terms of dealing with the people. So because India, again, uh, in terms of its cultural aspects, remains a very traditional society. If you can have a situation where the villagers and the local population does not have to dramatically change their lifestyle in order to get the same facilities, electricity, or other developmental aspects. That is also in sync with the broader project of having a human rights based approach to this transition. So that is all part of it. With respect to some of the policy shifts, again, like because we have to ensure we are on track, we'll not cover the technical aspects, but just if you can see the graphic, um, you'll notice that there is a focus on specific aspects: green hydrogen, critical minerals, solar manufacturing, PLI scheme. So PLI is basically production linked incentive scheme, which is, by the way, again at dispute at the WTO, where India is providing incentives to specific industries. But let's turn to the more important part, where HRBA enters. So first, in terms of the land acquisition, you would notice that the primary issue with projects, unless they are floating solar parks or any of those sort, the primary issue is acquiring land for non-fossil fuel generation, be it the windmills, the solar parks. This is the primary issue that is present when it comes to the HRBA implications. Second is displacement. Now, India has a huge history of litigation and social activism related to displacement. So, the most famous ones, if people want to like study, is the Narmada Bachao Andolan, and second is obviously the Chipko movement. So these are the two movements which really set the tone for future activism and litigation. So this is again second situation where HRB enters. Third is forest rights. So India wants to have at least 33% of its land as forested. Right now it's at around 26, so it's still almost close, but not right there. So again, when it comes to tribal, because you have to understand, India also has a huge indigenous population, around 20% indigenous people, one of the highest in the world, which are still very much integral part of the forest. So their forest rights, their right to minor resources in the forest. And finally, when it comes to energy access and pricing reform, so right now, uh, inflation and other issues have led to a spike in the excess in the energy excess pricing. So even fuel such as petrol or diesel, which is used on a daily basis, that has become pricier because of the non-availability of other like sources of the natural resources. So that's why I refer to the fact that India does not have exportable mineral resources such as petrol, diesel, or other fossil fuels. So that is a huge part of India's export and import policy again. With respect to land specifically, you would notice the central tension is resettlement, because the primary issue with the indigenous population is they want to avoid resettlement at all costs, because one, they are emotionally, even spiritually attached to the community and the environment that is present. So whenever there is a question of land and displacement, the real issue is resettlement, which obviously the indigenous population and the related social movements avoid. The solution for that would be having a proper committee that establishes criteria as to which projects will receive a go ahead for resettlement. So that inconsistency needs to be resolved. And also, obviously, the inefficient bureaucracy. That's again something that we have to work on. With respect to provision of consent, so FPIC jurisprudence, if you look at generally FPIC jurisprudence under international law, India has never specifically denounced any of the substantive obligations that come from FPIC norms. It agrees that there are some aspects which are directly applicable and are part of international customary law. So, in terms of the human rights issues such as provision of consent, consultation with indigenous populations, so India has not totally denounced it, but again, it has not provided a specific or a clear answer as to what are the mechanisms which India agrees in order to receive this consent, this fair consent. fair, prior, informed consent. How will India receive this consent, its indigenous population? So that again needs to be like made fairly clear in its policy work. It is also to be noted in the broader context that India does not have a climate policy. It does not have a dedicated climate policy which takes care of green energy transition and the related aspects. Now to the more critical aspects with respect to the distributional issues, just transition and burden reallocation. So right now the discussion broadly is at the global level about historical emissions, right? But a deeper question is within India itself, if you want to really look at the historical aspects and which are the populations or communities which have benefited or exploited the resources more? That is again a difficult question that India needs to ask itself because of the other angle. So India has a caste problem. India has a problem with in terms of insurgency at the border in like couple of important hotspots. So in those terms, that final integration into the Indian society that needs to take into account of the historical aspects within India itself, not just at the global level. This also goes to the question of innovative solutions that we need to discuss. So, one solution, one of the papers that I'm writing on is about this analysis between a right to vote vis-a-vis right to resources. So, in today's time, obviously, if let's say you had to like buy votes, right? It seems like a bizarre idea. How can you purchase like votes, right? The in terms of elections, but think about it in 30-40 years when we are absolutely short of resources, shouldn't wouldn't we have to imagine a world where there is a right to resources, to equal resources, regardless of your income? So today, regardless of your income, you have set you have specific and very like narrow rights. So why can't it be with in the case of resources itself? So that is obviously an idealistic approach that we have to look at, but this is not far-fetched given that we are going to encounter a situation. In terms of the literature that you have to like cover, that I have like covered, I've tried to delve into Rawls' theory of justice, obviously, and also Professor Amartya Sen's idea of justice. So these are, I would suggest, like two critical pieces of literature that on which my distributional fairness argument is based. So Amartya Sen's idea is mostly on the capability approach that you have to empower these people instead of handing them the resources, the direct access to resources, empower them through rights to education, rights to healthcare, so that they are part of this transition automatically and organically. Some procedural justice obligations. So again, these are technical and logistical aspects. So I'm not going to delve on it. You can see on the slide that this is again part of customary international environmental law. Many of these aspects, such as environmental impact assessment and so on and so forth. With respect to some case analysis, again, you can look it up when if you search the Gujarat Renewable Energy Belt and the Rajasthan Solar Park. Rajasthan has India's largest solar park, so it is a good case study in terms of how they acquired land, what were the issues in terms of the investments, what were the issues in terms of gendered labor precarity, how did they manage the labor issues in a state which is the only desert of India, really. Same goes to Gujarat. Gujarat is an arid land again. So these are like interesting case studies. So again, we have to like study these specific situations to understand the broader aspects. I'll come to my final part, like which is the procurement blind spot and the courts and human rights based approaches. So with respect to the procedural blind spot, we need to understand that many of these issues that India is dealing with are also coming due to the global headwinds, due to the global uh, issues in terms of lack of speedy energy transition, tariffs, no gateway clauses in human rights based approaches, due diligence are like sort of outside contracts. So we have to ensure that like in India's performance is tracked looking at the broader context of the global issues and the global affairs. With respect to the courts, again, because this comes from my work as a law professor, as an assistant lecturer at Jindal, I've tried to also understand what are the critical jurisprudential and legal issues. So primarily three come to my mind. One is the proportionality aspect. So India has been unable to really understand or like delineate, as judicial institutions should, what is the proportionality definition that they are going to apply? Is it in terms of the balance of harm, or is it in terms of the least intrusive measure? Let's say if it's about displacement. So are we going to apply the standard of least intrusive measure? With respect to Supreme Court, one of the issues right now is a lot of talk but no action. So India, because it does not have a compensatory mechanisms if rights are violated, there is no automatic compensation to the victims. It is merely satisfactory remedy. That has led to a situation where there have been very landmark cases which have resulted in no substantive remedy. And also issue is, um, many times courts enter after the harm is already done. In fact, um, it was a good thing that the Supreme Court recently struck down an amendment which allowed companies to have post facto environmental impact assessment done. So that obviously is again a very bizarre idea, completely against the rights set out both by the Indian Constitution and generally under international human rights law. So that is again something that the court needs to work on. With respect to, I'll turn to the recommendations directly now. There should be, as much possible, mandatory HRA gateway before assessee binds. Second, if you can have at the plant level escrowed benefits sharing, that would also ensure that the right communities are benefited. So let's say in terms of the sharing of biodiversity, benefits of like biodiversity mechanisms such as specific plants, some patented recipes, or like any other like transition related aspects such as the issues in terms of the settlements. So all of these, if there's a set plan and fixed predetermined benefit sharing, that would again, and we can again take inspiration from the international treaties itself. With respect to the Forest Rights Act's compliance, again, these are questions of financing, so not exactly relevant for us, but as long as they intersect with the human rights issues, we need to ensure that the right communities are financed like clearly, and whatever finances that occur at the level of the transition, those are again distributed fairly. With respect to a dashboard, again, some of these are like logistical aspects which the government is already undertaking, that it has right now a mechanism to determine the current energy levels, the capacity, which communities are behind. So again, some of these aspects have been like discussed in depth by other scholars, so I will not delve into it. But these are the recommendations broadly in order to like take care of these human rights based approaches. So yeah, in terms of my conclusion, I would just like to highlight that um, India has this unique situation, opportunity, much like China, to utilize its previous lack of using his or being part of historical emissions as a green card, as a passport in order to ask the other developed states, such as the European Union for that matter, to help them support in this transition. So that is actually an as part of our broader project, because we are all part of the EU values network. That is something that we can work on in terms of ensuring that neither we are cynical about the EU's role, nor are we paternalistic. We have a middle ground that will help us deal with it. So that's all, and I would obviously like be happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Rahul, for another very insightful presentation. I think your intervention provides quite, let's say, grounded perspective on what a human rights based approach to a green transition might look like, should look like in practice, right? I think one of the central points that you mentioned at the very beginning, which is that human rights cannot simply be added on to development projects, but really should be like embedded from the very beginning, both in, let's say, terms of normative foundations and procedural design is a particularly important one. Now, we'd like to open up the floor for questions, for discussion, obviously both from the chat, but also maybe Raul, Miranda, if you have questions for each other, obviously also feel free to engage a Q&A in that regard. Maybe to get the ball rolling, I will have a very general question, I think, focusing a little bit on the role of the EU in the process, since we're of course also talking about the EU as a development partner, and as a partner that also is vocal about wanting to integrate HRBA in its foreign policy as well. So obviously both Indonesia and India have extensive relations with the EU in trade, climate cooperation, governance, but each in their different ways, of course. And there's also the added, let's say, angle and perspective or level of governance of ASEAN that enters into the discussion here. How, and again, this is very general, how do you both maybe assess the EU's capacity to engage effectively with Asian partners, maybe in general, or focusing on India, Indonesia for your respective expertises? How do you assess the EU's capacity to engage effectively with these partners in Asia on a rights-based development? So do you think a shared understanding of what HRBA actually means in practice, or are we still really broadly speaking in parallel terms? So whoever wants to take the question first, feel free to speak up.
And I can go ahead. They must have been tired hearing me consecutive.
Okay, let me try to answer this, Philip. I think one of the most challenges when talking about Indonesian diplomacy, we have a very strict policy in that sense, right? Whoever partner that we have, especially international partner, has to be in line with our national development policy, which might not also sometimes doesn't in line with the EU policy to Southeast Asia or Indonesia. And but at the same time, so in terms of the topics or in terms of the approach, that's another story. And then, but at the same time, you also have to follow whatever aid management that Indonesia applied, including all the system, all the management operation has to follow with the government rules and other stuff. So when you're not approaching, I mean, if your partner is not directly with the government, so you can go directly without even, take the permission from the government. Then the question is whether that's also a G2G type of cooperation, or how you provide, necessary monitoring process that those program was applied in line with what the vision of the president, for example, of the government applied, which might be a bit different from maybe the EU itself, because sometimes the government only want this part, but the EU wanna be at that part. So those kind of negotiation, balancing whatever approach that they're using is one of the issues. And from what I see, because in my previous experience and over the past few months, I also start engaging again with this issue, and like asking a lot of several colleagues from the Ministry of Planning who work with the planning process. That's another different challenge. Sometimes what they avoid is directly mention about human rights, because those issues sometimes in Indonesia is also a bit more sensitive to be mentioned. So they need to use another, terminology or words that are highlighting those approach, to be including, engaging with a lot of more local partners that I mentioned before. Yeah. So how those two issues can be moderated, or finding the common ground is, I think that's another different challenge in a way. Because sometimes the definition what you perceive in European Union, you have your own definition, we might not be also applied in the context of Indonesia. So I think another challenge on integrating those understanding is also can be a bit challenging in that in the process of applying those development cooperation in Indonesia as well. I think that's my initial comment for the discussion.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you so much.
Yeah, so just to add on, and if I understand your question correctly about if there is a shared understanding of these approaches, the truth is they are on completely different planes right now, and they're like, I would point out two or three reasons. One, EU, because it's involved in the ECHR mechanism, both because it's a party to this convention and has a dedicated human rights court, takes these human rights way more seriously than the Indian courts, because the Indian human rights are mostly coming from the constitutional setup, the fundamental rights as they are called. So, and because, like I discussed in my presentation, they do not have an automatic remedy. These rights violations do not have an automatic compensation. In terms of their seriousness, they are on completely different planes for one reason. So EU in that sense is much ahead, which is why again one of my research interests is analyzing the ECHR jurisprudence and how that has affected generally like global human rights jurisprudence. But anyway, the second reason is because they are in different developmental stages. That again is a very critical factor in terms of their current economies, the population, their future growth. So EU right now wants to probably solidify because the population has stagnated. In fact, it's decreasing. So it needs to focus more on the distributional aspects. India right now is focused more on the growth aspect. So again, it is very, very different. But my intervention would be this cannot continue. You need, and this again comes from my inclination to have a universalist approach. You need to have dedicated international principles or an understanding that does not have this relativism that, okay, in this context, these principles are okay, or in this context, in the other context, these are okay. That approach has to go. You need to identify, ask yourself a simple question. What are the minimum obligations a developmental project, for instance, give out when it comes to displacement? Should there be environmental impact assessment? Yes. Should there be adequate compensation? Yes. What should be the mechanism? So we can find answers to it if we incorporate the successful frameworks from across the world, not just obviously EU and India. But yeah, to answer your question, we need to like be on the same page when it comes to understanding, and there is a lot of potential for it. India right now, especially what's with what's happening with the United States, India sees EU as a very natural partner. Democracy, want to work together, are closer physically also than some other states. So, and obviously we need to deal with some issues such as colonial hangover and those aspects. So, what I said in my presentation, a middle ground between this paternalistic and cynical approach, and I think there's a lot of potential to work on this understanding.
Thanks so much to both of you for answering the question in, let's say, a very comprehensive way. Again, highlighting, I guess, many more issues for discussion. One follow up question that I had when listening to both of you is that I think recurring theme today has been the difficulty of balancing economic interests with these normative goals of human rights and inclusion. And I think that Raul, you referred to the global headwinds, and we both, I think, you both referred to changing geopolitical landscape and the fact that it seems to be increasingly difficult for the EU or any partner basically that wants to have this normative aspiration as well to really, let's say, connect that with the economic realities, right? So how do you think the EU's engagement with Asia, with India, with Indonesia can move beyond this transactional model to one that genuinely integrates HRBA principles without losing this momentum in economic cooperation? I think also turning this into, let's say, something from the perspective of Asia, from of India, of Indonesia, for whom the EU is, Raul, you mentioned a natural partner, but it's just one of the partners. There's obviously a lot of other partners as well. So also taking maybe a broader perspective, how do other partners that are important for India, Indonesia tackle this? And do you think they are more, let's say, successful in that respect? I don't know. It's a two-part question. Maybe I'm touching on a lot of different things, but it's a complex issue. So again, whoever wants to take this first.
Okay, thank you, Philip. I think in terms of Indonesia, yeah, I think some more localized. For me, yes, maybe the definition need to be more universal, but at least, you know, that's also be for me. It's also be quite challenging in a way, right? sometimes we have our own way of understanding things, including in terms of human rights. I mean, with the current government situation, who you might know, he has a long history about human rights violation in the past. So that kind of an issues might be a bit challenging if you just say it directly, you know.
Mm.
So that's another political aspect that at least it will be might be sensitive if we're talking about that in that sense of directness.
Mm.
And but then another aspect that you for me that you can engage more, I think it goes also beyond the context of just a local just a traditional partners, NGO, you know, small uh for I mean international organizations, but also a lot of small medium enterprises group that engage in economic are huge in Indonesia, and
Mm.
also a tech group that is not the huge technology group, but more smaller group that they have their sort of organization is also important to engage, because they're the one who's making wave or voices now in that sense of bringing the idea of you know the value of that, bringing not directly attacking in that sense of human rights, because we're talking about human rights in Indonesian politics now is to
Mm.
be honest is high for me is quite sensitive. So I think engaging in those with those people it will be very important. I haven't read the EU Indonesian EU CEPA the document fully, so I don't know where you put this small medium enterprises group, especially the woman-owned medium enterprises, because they are huge and they are the backbone of Indonesian economy. So if you're not engaging with them, I think you will miss a lot of opportunity in the economic, I guess.
Mm.
The biggest player in Indonesia economy is them,
Mm.
and not the big enterprises. Yeah, yes, they're big in that sense of economy, but I think small medium enterprises is quite huge in being nurtured quite a lot by the government as well, because there are so many supported for them. We understand that our economy is because of them. So that's a leeway that you can. I mean, the EU can work towards those group if we're talking about human rights in the context of economy.
Mm.
So I think that's my initial comment, and I think for the second one is yeah, I guess in yeah, I mean, if talking about development, um partners, everyone
Mm.
has their own way of doing, right?
Mm.
I mean, if we're talking about Indonesian biggest development partner is still Japan, but
Mm.
most of their work is in infrastructure. Japan always combine loan and grant. Yeah, so they're not just working in the context of a grant. In that, we're talking about European Union. Mostly, your support is in terms of grant, right? So,
Mm.
but Japan, China, always combining those two, loan and grant. But because I think one of the why they're the biggest, because a lot of their support is in terms of infrastructure project, which might
Mm.
is money generated project as well. And then government has their own way of working with bilateral as well. So I think the approach is not the same
Mm.
from one to the other, even though our regulation might, the regulation that they need to follow is the same, but the way of approaching issues or approaching those programs, it might be different from one to another. And I think and it sometimes is also highly political. We're talking about the new partners in development for Indonesia, because if talking about China, I mean, Japan has a long history with Indonesia. They've been in the Indonesian development partner maybe since 1970s. But China actually just coming to Indonesia as development partner officially only in 2015. So less than 10 years. But over the last 10 years, it's been raising it as the second biggest lender, if I'm not mistaken, if for Indonesia. But yeah, and the other partner as well has their own way of looking at it. And I think in a lot of way, especially with the diminishing of USAID in Indonesia, I think European Union has definitely more political position in terms of supporting those issues, especially NGOs, civil society, as well as the other non-governmental group that is also important to the society as well. I think that's my take
Mm.
on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
So,
Rahul?
yeah, so very interesting question as to how we can move beyond this transaction relationship. I think first thing would be to accept that these are shared global challenges, and
mm,
unless we work together, we would not have a fair, or rather a world to exist, right? So we have to ensure that even if we are able to overcome these challenges of energy transition, this critical aspect of human rights issues that arise, these are shared challenges because one, no, and obviously this is not just a problem between EU and India, but generally also this tendency to say that there is a difference in terms of human rights approaches
mm,
that then takes the discussion away from the universal rights that we have to look on and universal challenges that we, because at the end of the day, the reason why we want to focus on these human rights is to tackle these shared challenges. Second, the good thing is both people to people ties and governmental relations are at a very like good place when it comes to India and EU. So
mm,
EU as a whole and even individually, there is a lot of goodwill between the two countries. So that colonial hangover is almost over, I would say. So we have to take advantage of that. We have to increase dialogue, obviously, increase student exchanges, increase even investment. So right now, India and EU are on track to, by the end of this year, finalize a bilateral treaty, investment treaty, and it has already made a treaty with the EFTA countries. So now the question is with EU, and they'll probably have a deal by the end of the year. They already had a draft deal, and it will probably be ratified by the end of the year. So these are like good signs. Um, in terms of the solutions, the specific solutions, I think in order to move away from this transactional relationship, it would be also helpful to focus on the side issues which do not seem exactly relevant but influence the overall working of these of the cooperation, for example immigration. So
mm,
the good thing is India and EU are pretty much on same terms with respect to that. EU till now hasn't really had a problem in terms of the Indian government in Indian government's approach to both the exodus and the treatment of its diaspora. Unlike, let's say, for instance, Bangladesh right now. Bangladesh
mm,
right now serious problem bilaterally with the European Union. That, and it is surprising given India's size and tendency of people to migrate, that still hasn't come to the fore like for the United States. Obviously, this could be because of cultural, pop culture reasons why people move to United States, but
mm,
generally we need to focus on these side issues to bring the focus back on the main issue so that there are no thorns in the discussions. So you just remove, if there are any like these side issues, just remove them so that you can have a fair discussion. So for instance, you would frequently notice that EU, for instance, let's say makes a comment on some of the human, or let's say treatment of the minorities in India, right? Suddenly the Indian government would be very protective and defensive of it. So
mm,
that we need to have a thicker skin in order to deal with these issues, and again understand that we are trying to act in the best interest of like both like peoples, and there is no ill intention, right? So that I think it's about time we do that. And and finally the good thing is there's a bipartisan support for a stronger relationship with the European Union. So in India,
mm,
both parties, the two primary parties, have a very strong inclination to have a very good collaboration with EU. So we have to take advantages of these, and most importantly, learn from the mistakes and the successful experiments of the specific countries. So EU, for instance, right now has a ECHR. We have to learn from that. We have to learn from the fact that it has a dedicated human rights code. Why Asia, for example, has failed to have something like an Asian human rights code, right? Or a regional SARC code between South Asian countries. So these
mm.
are things we have to learn from. Again, uh, as many people say, the West needs to learn some spiritualism, the East needs to learn some materialism, and obviously we can have a middle ground. So there's a lot of scope for that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Raul, for these concluding remarks. I think it's all we have time for today, unfortunately. So thank you so much, Miranda, Rahul, for your thought-provoking presentations. I think today's discussions, let's say, highlighted in their own way a lot of the themes that we also heard in our previous webinars in this series. So both promise and complexity in, let's say, advancing these human rights-based approaches to development, and it shows the importance, let's say, of HRBA having to be, well, as you mentioned, Raul, grounded in universal values and universal rights, it also has to be always context sensitive. Miranda, you referred to the need for it to be genuinely participatory, having a focus and attention to, in case of Indonesia, SMEs, women-led SMEs specifically. Ultimately, HRBA has to be genuinely co-owned by all the partners involved, from Asia, from the European Union as well. And I think that in your presentations, a lot of these aspects again came to the fore and showed why this is still such an important discussion to have. So with this, we conclude our final webinar in the EU Values series on human rights-based approaches to development cooperation. On behalf of the network, I thank all the speakers and participants across the 4 sessions for their very invaluable contributions. So thank you once again, and I wish you all a very good rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Philip, for personally organizing this and ensuring that we are on board with this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you
Bye.
for the opportunity.
In touch, yes.
See you all in Jakarta.
See you. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.